She took everything in the divorce, but I still had the one thing she couldn't buy, and that would be her undoing. The realization hit me as I sat in my empty apartment, staring at the single folding chair that remained from what used to be our life together. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every shared memory had been cataloged, appraised, and divided with surgical precision by her attorney. Even the coffee maker, our first purchase as newlyweds, now sat in her pristine new condo across town. But there was something Rebecca hadn't factored into her meticulous calculations, something that couldn't be itemized on a divorce settlement spreadsheet. My reputation. 23 years I'd spent building relationships in this industry. 23 years of handshake deals, late-night phone calls, and the kind of trust that money can't manufacture. While Rebecca had been busy liquidating our assets and transferring funds to offshore accounts I didn't even know existed, she'd overlooked the most valuable thing I possessed: the respect of every contractor, supplier, and developer in the tri-state area. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd always dismissed my work as blue-collar networking, rolling her eyes when I'd spend Saturdays at job sites or evenings at industry events. Little did she know that those relationships would become the foundation of her destruction. The discovery of her betrayal still felt raw, like a wound that refused to scab over. 3 months had passed since that Thursday evening when everything shattered. I'd come home early from a delayed project meeting, eager to surprise her with dinner from her favorite Italian place. The house had been dark, but her car was in the driveway. I'd climbed the stairs with excitement bubbling in my chest, imagining her face when she saw the tiramisu I'd special ordered. Instead, I found her in our bedroom with David Chen, her business partner. My business partner too, technically, since I'd fronted the money for their marketing consultancy 3 years earlier. The sound of my key in the front door had given them just enough warning to throw on clothes, but not enough to erase the guilt written across both their faces. The confrontation had been swift and brutal. No tears, no pleas for forgiveness, just cold calculation. Rebecca informed me, with the same tone she used to discuss quarterly projections, that she'd been planning this for months. The consultancy was already being restructured to exclude me. Her attorney had been retained weeks ago. She'd documented every asset, every account, every investment we'd made together. What followed was 6 months of legal warfare that left me financially decimated. Rebecca's attorney was a shark who specialized in high-asset divorces, while I'd naively trusted our family lawyer, a kind man better suited for writing wills than defending against coordinated asset stripping. By the time I realized how outmatched I was, Rebecca had systematically dismantled our shared life with military precision. The house, gone, sold to cover her claims of sweat equity in our joint investments. The vacation property in Maine, transferred to her name months before she filed, when I'd foolishly signed papers she claimed were for tax purposes. Even my vintage motorcycle, inherited from my father, had somehow become marital property subject to division. But the cruelest cut had been watching her and David parade their relationship publicly while the divorce was still being finalized. They'd started attending industry events together, positioning themselves as a power couple in the marketing world. Rebecca would introduce David as her partner with that radiant smile I once thought was reserved for me, while I sat in my empty apartment, eating takeout off paper plates. The rage had consumed me for weeks. I'd lie awake planning elaborate fantasies of revenge, exposing their affair to their biggest clients, keying David's luxury sedan, confronting them at their favorite restaurant. But those were the fantasies of a broken man, and I wasn't broken. I was just temporarily redistributed. The turning point came during a chance encounter at Murphy's Pub, a dive bar where contractors gathered after long days. I'd been nursing a beer and wallowing in self-pity when Tommy Rodriguez slapped me on the back. Tommy ran the largest electrical contracting firm in the city, and we'd worked together on dozens of projects over the years. His weathered face creased with concern as he settled onto the adjacent bar stool. Without me saying a word, he launched into a tirade about how Rebecca and David had approached his company about a marketing contract. The meeting had been a disaster, he explained. They'd clearly researched his business, but had no understanding of the construction industry's culture or needs. Worse, they'd quoted him a fee structure that was completely disconnected from reality. As Tommy continued describing their pitch, I felt something shift inside my chest. The grief and anger that had been consuming me for months began crystallizing into something sharper, more focused. Rebecca and David might have taken everything I owned, but they'd also inherited something they weren't equipped to handle: the responsibility of succeeding in my world. That night, I opened my laptop and began making lists, not of what I'd lost, but of what I knew. Every contractor who'd ever trusted me with a referral, every supplier who'd extended credit based on my word, every developer who'd called me for advice on choosing subcontractors. The network I'd built wasn't written down anywhere. It existed in handshakes and shared experiences, and the kind of professional bonds that Rebecca had always been too sophisticated to understand. More importantly, I began researching Rebecca and David's new venture. Their website promised industry-disrupting marketing solutions for the modern construction professional. Their client list was impressive on paper. 3 major firms had signed 6-figure contracts in the past 2 months. But as I dug deeper, cracks began to show. The first red flag was their pricing model. They were charging premium rates for services that established industry players provided at half the cost. The second was their timeline promises, guaranteeing results that I knew from experience took months to achieve. But the biggest issue was their fundamental misunderstanding of how business gets done in construction. Rebecca had always been brilliant at marketing to corporate executives and tech startups. She understood how to speak their language, how to position services as investments rather than expenses. But construction was different. It was relationship-based, built on trust and proven results. Contractors didn't care about award-winning creative campaigns or social media engagement metrics. They wanted partners who understood their challenges and could deliver tangible value. I spent the next 2 weeks reaching out to old contacts, not to badmouth Rebecca and David, but simply to reconnect. I met with foremen over coffee, caught up with project managers at industry events, and gradually rebuilt the professional relationships that my marriage's implosion had neglected. The conversations were natural and unforced. These were people I'd known for years, and they were genuinely happy to hear from me. During these casual interactions, Rebecca and David's names came up organically. Frank Morrison, who ran a mid-sized general contracting firm, mentioned they'd pitched his company the previous week. He was considering their proposal, but felt uncertain about their understanding of his business model. Sarah Kim, a project manager at a commercial development company, had similar concerns about their timeline projections. I didn't push or criticize. I simply listened and asked thoughtful questions that helped my contacts think through their decisions more carefully. When Frank mentioned concerns about timeline, I asked if he'd seen examples of similar projects they'd completed. When Sarah questioned their pricing structure, I wondered aloud how it compared to what she'd paid for marketing services in the past. The beauty of this approach was its subtlety. I wasn't sabotaging Rebecca and David's business. I was helping my professional network make informed decisions. If their services were truly valuable, my gentle questioning would only help them refine their value proposition. But if their offering was as hollow as I suspected, well, the truth has a way of surfacing. 3 weeks into my quiet campaign, the first domino fell. Frank Morrison called to ask if I was available for a consulting project. His company had decided against Rebecca and David's proposal and instead wanted to work with someone who truly understood their industry. The project was small, just a few $1,000s, but it represented something much more significant. I was back in the game. Over the following month, 3 more opportunities materialized. Word was spreading through the network that I was available for independent consulting. The projects varied in scope, but they all shared a common thread. Clients who had either passed on Rebecca and David's services or were reconsidering their commitments. The psychological shift was profound. For 6 months, I'd felt like a victim of Rebecca's calculated betrayal. Now I was remembering who I'd been before our marriage, a skilled professional with deep industry knowledge and hard-earned relationships. She'd taken my possessions, but she couldn't take my competence. As my consulting work grew, I began hearing more detailed feedback about Rebecca and David's performance. The picture that emerged was exactly what I'd anticipated. They were delivering technically proficient marketing materials, glossy brochures, polished websites, professional photography, but missing the mark on industry-specific needs. Their biggest client, Meridian Construction, had signed a 12-month contract worth $200,000. But 3 months in, tensions were already surfacing. According to my source inside the company, Rebecca and David's social media campaigns were generating plenty of engagement, but 0 qualified leads. Their redesigned website looked beautiful, but had eliminated the technical specifications and project galleries that potential clients actually wanted to see. The irony was perfect. Rebecca had always criticized my industry for being behind the times, resistant to modern marketing approaches. But what she'd interpreted as backwardness was actually sophistication. These companies had refined their customer acquisition processes over decades and knew exactly what worked. I watched from a distance as Rebecca and David struggled to adapt their proven strategies to an industry they fundamentally misunderstood. They were like brilliant surgeons trying to perform dentistry, skilled professionals failing because they were operating outside their area of expertise. The temptation to accelerate their downfall was constant, but I resisted. My revenge needed to be perfect, untraceable, and absolutely devastating. More importantly, it needed to be built on substance rather than sabotage. I wanted Rebecca to lose everything the same way I had, through her own miscalculations and overconfidence. The opportunity for deeper action came during a conversation with Maria Santos, the procurement director at Pinnacle Development Group. Pinnacle was Rebecca and David's second largest client, with a contract worth $150,000. Maria had worked with me on several projects over the years and trusted my judgment implicitly. She mentioned almost casually that Pinnacle was struggling with their current marketing approach. Rebecca and David had convinced them to pivot away from traditional industry publications toward a digital-first strategy focused on LinkedIn and industry websites. The transition had been rocky, with lead generation dropping significantly over the past quarter. I listened sympathetically and asked if they'd benchmarked their results against previous campaigns. Maria admitted they hadn't established clear baseline metrics before implementing the new strategy. When I suggested some industry-standard measurement approaches, she asked if I'd be willing to conduct an informal audit of their marketing effectiveness. The audit request felt like Christmas morning. For 2 days, I immersed myself in Pinnacle's marketing data, analyzing everything from website traffic patterns to lead conversion rates. The results were even worse than I'd anticipated. Rebecca and David's sophisticated digital strategy had increased Pinnacle's online visibility, but completely missed their target audience. They'd optimized for general business keywords rather than construction-specific terms. Their content calendar focused on broad industry trends rather than the specific challenges faced by Pinnacle's potential clients. Most damaging of all, they'd eliminated the case study section that had been Pinnacle's most effective lead generation tool. My audit report was clinical and professional, focused entirely on data and performance metrics. I didn't mention Rebecca and David by name or criticize their approach directly. Instead, I presented clear evidence of declining performance across every meaningful indicator and provided specific recommendations for improvement. When Maria received the report, her response was immediate and decisive. Pinnacle terminated their contract with Rebecca and David's consultancy that same week, citing performance issues and strategic misalignment. They hired me as their interim marketing consultant, with the possibility of a long-term arrangement pending results. The news of Pinnacle's departure sent shockwaves through the small world of construction marketing. Other clients began scrutinizing their own results more carefully, and the whispers I'd been hearing for months grew louder and more pointed. Rebecca called me for the first time since our divorce was finalized. Her voice was tight with controlled anger as she accused me of sabotaging their business. I listened patiently to her accusations, feeling a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. When she finished, I responded with calm professionalism. I explained that I'd simply been doing my job, helping clients evaluate their marketing effectiveness and make informed decisions. If their clients were choosing to work with me instead, perhaps they should examine why their services weren't meeting expectations rather than assuming malicious interference. The conversation ended with Rebecca threatening legal action, but we both knew she had no grounds. Everything I'd done was legitimate business practice. I'd never lied about their performance or made false claims about my own capabilities. I'd simply provided accurate information to people who trusted my judgment. Over the following weeks, the dominoes continued falling with accelerating momentum. Meridian Construction, their flagship client, chose not to renew their contract after it expired. 2 smaller clients followed suit, and the 3 major prospects in their sales pipeline all selected competitors. I learned about each development through my network, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. Rebecca had played this game better than I had initially, but she'd made a crucial error. She'd assumed that taking everything I owned would leave me powerless. Instead, it had freed me to focus on the one asset she couldn't touch. The final blow came 6 months after I'd started my consulting practice. David Chen reached out through a mutual contact, asking if I'd be interested in acquiring their client list and contracts. The consultancy was hemorrhaging money, and they needed to liquidate assets quickly to avoid bankruptcy. The irony was exquisite. Rebecca, who had systematically stripped away everything I'd built over 2 decades, was now forced to sell the remnants of their shared business to the man she'd betrayed. The asking price was laughably low, less than I'd recovered in my first month of independent consulting. I scheduled a meeting at a downtown coffee shop, curious to see how Rebecca would handle this reversal of fortune. She arrived 15 minutes late, her usual power dressing impeccable despite the circumstances. David looked exhausted, his expensive suit rumpled and his confidence visibly shaken. The negotiation was brief and businesslike. They needed cash immediately and I had leverage. I offered half their asking price, non-negotiable, with payment contingent on a clean transition of all client relationships. Rebecca's jaw tightened at my terms, but David was already nodding acceptance. As we signed the paperwork, I felt an unexpected emptiness rather than triumph. This moment I'd been anticipating for months felt anticlimactic, like reaching the summit of a mountain only to discover the view was obscured by clouds. Rebecca looked up from the contract with something approaching respect in her eyes. She asked quietly how I'd done it. How had I rebuilt so quickly after losing everything? I considered lying or offering some platitude about resilience, but the truth seemed more fitting. I explained that she'd been right about me all along. I was just a blue-collar networker who understood relationships better than spreadsheets. But that limitation had become my greatest strength when she'd forced me to start over. She'd taken everything she could quantify and transfer, but she'd left behind the intangible assets that actually mattered in my world. Trust, reputation, and professional relationships couldn't be divided in a divorce settlement or stolen through clever legal maneuvering. The meeting ended with an awkward handshake and promises to coordinate the client transitions professionally. As I watched Rebecca and David walk away, their body language deflated and defeated, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. The revenge was complete, but it tasted different than I'd imagined. For months, I'd fantasized about this moment, seeing Rebecca reduced to asking for my help, watching her proud confidence crumble under the weight of her miscalculations. But now that it was happening, the satisfaction felt hollow and temporary. That evening, I sat in my new apartment, still sparsely furnished, but by choice rather than circumstance, and reflected on the past year. Rebecca had taken everything in the divorce, but I'd discovered something valuable in the wreckage. I was stronger and more self-reliant than I'd been in years. My business was thriving, my reputation was restored, and I had clarity about what actually mattered. The one thing she couldn't buy had turned out to be more than just my professional relationships. It was my ability to rebuild, to adapt, and to find opportunity in disaster. She'd tried to destroy me, but instead she'd freed me from a marriage that had been slowly suffocating my authentic self. 6 months later, my consulting practice had evolved into a full-service agency specializing in construction industry marketing. I'd hired 3 employees, signed a lease on proper office space, and established partnerships with several industry associations. The business was generating more revenue than Rebecca and David's consultancy had ever achieved. More importantly, I'd found peace with the entire experience. The rage and desire for revenge had been replaced by gratitude for the hard-learned lessons and genuine excitement about building something new. Rebecca had given me an unexpected gift by forcing me to rediscover my own capabilities. I heard through the grapevine that she'd taken a corporate marketing position with a technology company in Seattle. David had returned to his previous firm as a junior associate. Their relationship had apparently ended shortly after their business collapsed, another casualty of the stress and financial pressure. I felt no satisfaction in their personal pain, only a quiet recognition that justice had been served through natural consequences rather than deliberate sabotage. They'd overreached, misunderstood their market, and paid the predictable price for their arrogance. The construction industry had taught them the same lesson it had taught me years earlier, that success isn't about having the shiniest tools or the most sophisticated strategies. It's about understanding your environment, respecting your relationships, and delivering value consistently over time. Rebecca had been right that she could take everything in our divorce. She'd stripped away every material possession and financial asset we'd accumulated together, but she'd been wrong about what constituted everything. The foundation of my professional life, built on trust, competence, and genuine relationships, had been beyond her reach. That foundation had become the platform for reconstruction, allowing me to rebuild not just my career, but my entire life. I was healthier, happier, and more professionally fulfilled than I'd been in years. The divorce that was meant to destroy me had instead become the catalyst for discovering who I really was beneath 2 decades of compromise and accommodation. As I locked up my office that final evening, reviewing the completed client transitions and preparing for a well-deserved vacation, I realized that Rebecca's greatest miscalculation hadn't been underestimating my professional relationships. It had been assuming that breaking me down would keep me down. She'd taken everything in the divorce, except the one thing that couldn't be bought, stolen, or transferred: my capacity to rebuild. And that had made all the difference.